Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're jumping into one of the biggest turning points in all of human history, the agricultural revolution. But what if the story you think you know is just plain wrong? Let's dig in.
So, how was farming invented? We tend to picture this single stroke of genius, right? Some brilliant ancestor having a light bulb moment that changed the world forever. That's the simple story. But the real story, uncovered by decades of incredible research, is so much more complex and honestly, way more interesting.
So on one side, you have that classic eureka myth, but the reality, it's something else entirely. Farming wasn't an invention at all. It was this messy, thousand-year-long experiment run by thousands of different people in multiple places. It was a true patchwork of trial and, believe me, a whole lot of error.
So, yeah, let's just toss that idea of a single invention right out the window. The agricultural revolution was this totally decentralized, sprawling process that looked really different depending on where you were standing.
I want you to picture the ancient Near East not as one big laboratory, but as a huge landscape just dotted with countless little independent labs. All across the Fertile Crescent, different groups of people were tinkering, trying new things, and figuring out totally new ways to manage the plants and animals that were all around them.
And to really get a handle on this whole patchwork idea, we're going to zoom in on two of these key experiment zones. Way over in the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran, the big project was animal management, specifically goats. Meanwhile, further west in the southern Levant, people were all in on cultivating plants, especially cereals. See? Two different regions, two different problems, and two totally unique sets of solutions starting to bubble up.
All right, let's open our first case file. We're heading to the Zagros Mountains, because this is where we find some of the absolute earliest and clearest evidence for animal domestication really taking hold.
I mean, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you go from hunting a wild, unpredictable animal to actually managing a whole herd of them? You can't just walk up and throw a leash on a wild goat. The answer is way more subtle. It's hidden in a small shift in human behavior, a shift that left behind a very specific clue for us to find.
Archaeologists have a great name for it, the herd management fingerprint. Now, this isn't a physical object you can pick up. It's a pattern, a telltale sign they find in piles of ancient animal bones. And it's proof that people weren't just hunting anymore. They were starting to think like ranchers. And this chart shows you exactly what that fingerprint looks like. See, when you're hunting, you basically take whatever you can get. But when you start managing a herd, you make strategic calls. You get rid of the young males for meat because you only need a few for breeding. But you protect the females, you let them live, because they're the ones who are going to grow your herd. Finding this exact pattern, tons of young male bones and very few breeding-age female bones, that is the smoking gun for early herding.
And the evidence for this is just overwhelming. At key archaeological sites like Ganj Dareh, this culling pattern is crystal clear. On top of that, ancient DNA analysis confirms that these early managed goats form their own distinct genetic group, the ancestors of so many domesticated goats we have today. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum either. People in the very same region were running a similar playbook with sheep at the same time. Okay, so that's the animal side of the story. Now let's jump clear across the Fertile Crescent to the southern Levant. We're going to look at a completely different kind of experiment, this time with plants.
First, though, we have to get a really important distinction straight. You have cultivation and you have domestication. Cultivation is the action. It's what humans do. You can go out and cultivate a totally wild plant. Domestication, on the other hand, is the result. It's what happens to the plant itself. It literally changes genetically and becomes dependent on us to survive. So the key takeaway is that cultivation comes first, and it can go on for a very, very long time before plant is ever truly domesticated.
So how in the world can we actually see that genetic change in plants from thousands of years ago? Well, it all comes down to one tiny but unbelievably important part of a cereal plant, the rachis. It's basically the little stem that holds the seed or the grain onto the main stalk. And believe it or not, whether that little piece is weak or strong tells us absolutely everything. And here's why it's such a big deal. Wild wheat has a brittle, fragile rachis. A light breeze comes along and poof, the seeds scatter everywhere. Now, that's great for the plant. That's how it reproduces. But it's a nightmare for a farmer trying to collect the grain. So, just by harvesting the plants whose seeds didn't fall off, early farmers accidentally selected for a genetic mutation, a tough rachis that holds on tight to its seeds. It's a disaster for the plant in the wild, but it was an absolute game changer for humanity. But, and this is a huge but, it wasn't a clean, simple switch. When archaeologists look at early sites for barley, for example, they find this confusing mess, a mix of plants that have wild traits and plants that have domestic traits all jumbled together. And that messiness, that's actually a crucial part of the story. It reminds us that this was a slow, gradual, experimental process, not some sudden event.
So you might be wondering, how on earth do scientists piece this 1,000-year-old story together from tiny little bones and seeds? Well, it turns out they have this amazing toolkit full of forensic techniques. Let's take a quick peek inside. Okay, for the animals, the zoo archaeologists are the detectives on the case. They create those mortality profiles we talked about, that's the culling pattern. They calculate the ratio of male to female bones. They track tiny changes in the animal's body size over many generations. And they even analyze chemical isotopes in the bones to figure out what the animals were eating and if humans were moving them around the landscape. It's incredible stuff. And then for the plants, the archaeobotanists take over. They're the ones looking at those all-important rachis traits under a microscope. They identify the types of weeds found alongside the crops, because some weeds only grow in tilled soil, a dead giveaway for cultivation. And they painstakingly track the percentage of wild versus domestic plants through different layers of soil to literally map the change as it happened over time. So let's step back for a second. We've got the story of the goats in the east and the story of the cereals in the west. And when you put these two case files together, the big picture of this patchwork revolution really starts to come into focus. It clearly wasn't one single process. You see, in the Zagros, the whole game was about managing animal behavior. We see the proof in those herd culling patterns, and the result was domesticated goats. But in the Levant, it was all about managing plant genetics, with the proof being that non-shattering rachis, which gave us domesticated wheat. Two totally different approaches, two different sets of evidence, all part of the same massive human transformation.
And this quote just nails it perfectly. The Near East didn't flip a switch from wild to domestic. It ran thousands of years of experiments. You could think of it as humanity's biggest, longest, and probably most important research and development project ever. And you know what that really tells us is that maybe our species' greatest superpower isn't that single flash of genius. Maybe it's our incredible ability to stick with a problem, to engage in a long, slow, messy, and collaborative process of trial and error, learning from our failures and building on tiny successes over centuries. And that kind of leaves us with a final question to chew on. If humanity's most profound, world-changing transformation didn't come from a single, neat and tidy idea, but from this sprawling, messy, decade-spanning patchwork of experiments, what does that tell us about how we should be looking for breakthroughs and big innovations in our own time?